She walked in, wearing civilian clothes, until her fingerprint unlocked. The classified war room. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987. It was 2 pages. Government letterhead. Department of Defense, Washington, D.C. Helen Marsh read it twice at the kitchen table in Fayetteville, North Carolina, before she set it down and went back to making coffee. She was 34 years old. Had spent the last 9 years working as a GS-7 intelligence analyst at Fort Bragg, reviewing signal intercepts and translating documents from 4 languages. The letter informed her that her position had been reclassified. The reclassification took effect in 30 days. Her security clearance, TS/Psi with SIGINT access, would be suspended pending review. She'd never been disciplined, never been late, never missed a deadline. The letter didn't explain why. Helen folded the letter once, lengthwise, put it back in the envelope, left it on the table next to her coffee cup, drove to work. At Fort Bragg, the morning smelled the way it always did in early spring. Red clay damp from overnight rain. Diesel from the motor pool. Coffee burning in the break room down the hall from her office. She had a window that faced west, toward the tree line. She'd hung a single laminated map of Central Europe on the wall beside it. The map had 14 colored pins marking locations she wasn't allowed to discuss outside the building. Her supervisor, Major Gerald T. Harwick, called her in at 9:15. He had a yellow legal pad on his desk and a pen he kept clicking. He was 47, a career Army officer from Galveston, Texas, who had been overseeing the Signals Intelligence Division at Bragg for 3 years. He did not make eye contact when she sat down. He said the reclassification was a structural decision, a reorganization. He said her skills were valued. He said the review process typically took 60 to 90 days. He said she should not be concerned. Helen asked one question. She asked whether the reclassification was connected to the meeting in November 1986, when she had submitted a written assessment contradicting the division's official estimate on Soviet troop positioning along the East German corridor. Harwick clicked his pen, told her the 2 things were unrelated. She returned to her desk, pulled up the November report on her terminal. Read her own assessment again, word by word. Her estimate had put Soviet armored units 40 kilometers further east than the division consensus. 6 weeks later, a separate satellite analysis from the National Reconnaissance Office had confirmed her positioning within 12 kilometers. The division consensus had been wrong. Her assessment had been right. Nobody had mentioned it in the meeting minutes. Nobody had mentioned it at all. Helen kept working. The 30 days ran out. She turned in her access badge on April 14, 1987. The security desk gave her a receipt. A laminated visitor pass replaced her badge. She had 3 more days to transition her active files to a colleague. On the 3rd day, she packed a cardboard box with personal items. A travel mug. A framed photo of her family. A Spanish dictionary she'd kept on the shelf for 9 years. The map with 14 pins she left where it was. It wasn't hers to take. The gate guards knew her by name, had known her for 9 years. They checked her visitor pass the same way they checked everyone else's. That was their job. Helen Marsh drove out of Fort Bragg on April 17, 1987, in a 1982 Chevy Citation that needed new brake pads. Turned north on All-American Freeway. The morning was cold. She had $2,400 in savings. A lease on a 2-bedroom apartment that ran through October. A federal employee performance record rated outstanding for 6 consecutive years and exceptional for the 3 years before that. She had no current job offer. The 3 people she called that week gave her 3 different pieces of advice. Her father, a retired Navy warrant officer from Pensacola, Florida, told her to hire a lawyer. Her friend from Fort Meade told her to wait it out. A former colleague who now worked in private sector defense contracting in Reston, Virginia, told her the review process was a formality. Told her she'd be reinstated in 60 days. Told her she'd be back at her desk by summer. She thanked all three of them, wrote down what they said, did none of it. Instead, she spent the first 3 weeks in Fayetteville in the public library, the main branch on Branson Avenue, 2 miles from her apartment. She was there when it opened at 9 a.m., most mornings. She pulled Federal Register publications, Congressional Research Service reports, and General Accounting Office transcripts. She read the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. Read the relevant sections of the National Security Act. Read the Whistleblower Protection Act, which had passed in 1978 and had been largely ineffective for intelligence community employees who were exempted from most of its provisions. She took notes in a yellow legal pad she'd bought at Walgreens for 89 cents. By the end of those 3 weeks, Helen had mapped the administrative review process in enough detail to understand one thing clearly. Her reinstatement would not come from waiting. The review process for intelligence community employees existed to bureaucratically delay, not to resolve. The average documented review in cases she could find through public records had taken 14 months. 3 had never formally closed. She drove to Reston, Virginia, on a Monday in May. Her former colleague, a man named Dennis Kowalski, who had left Fort Bragg in 1984, worked for a company called Strategic Resource Associates. The company had a suite on the 4th floor of a beige office building near Dulles Airport. The lobby smelled of carpet cleaner and recirculated air. The receptionist had a bowl of wrapped mints on the desk. Kowalski met her in a conference room. He was 41, wore a gray suit jacket over a white Oxford shirt. He'd gained weight since Fort Bragg. He offered coffee. She accepted. He told her SRA had a need for contract analysts. Entry level, technically, because she didn't currently hold active clearance. Pay would be $18 per hour. No benefits at that rate. She'd be reviewing unclassified commercial satellite imagery and open-source trade publications from Eastern Bloc countries. The work was legitimate, but well below what she'd been doing. He said it was a bridge, said her clearance would likely be reinstated, and she could convert to a direct hire position at that point. He said it with the same tone Harwick had used when he said she should not be concerned. Helen asked Kowalski whether SRA had a position in signals intelligence analysis. He said those roles required current T-Psi access. She said she understood. She asked whether any of SRA's government contracts involved analysis work, where her language skills would be directly used. He mentioned a Treasury Department contract focused on Eastern European financial flows. Said it might eventually expand. Said she'd have to start with the satellite imagery work first. She told him she'd think about it. Drove back to Fayetteville. She deposited $18 per hour in her mind, next to $2,400 in savings, and a lease that ran through October, and thought about it mathematically. $18 per hour, 40 hours per week, no benefits, minus rest and rent, which started at $650 per month for a 1-bedroom. The numbers were tight, not impossible. But the floor was thin. She thought about it for 48 hours. Then she called a number she'd found in the Federal Register listing for the Defense Intelligence Agency. The DIA had a civilian recruitment office. The number was public. Helen had been prepared to leave a message. A woman answered on the second ring. Helen explained her situation in 5 sentences. The woman listened, said the DIA's direct hiring for senior analyst positions required active clearance in most cases, but that a new program had just been authorized. It was called the Reserve Analyst Integration Initiative. It allowed former cleared personnel to apply for limited-term civilian re-entry positions while their reinstatement was under review. The woman said the program was small. Only 11 slots had been authorized in the first year. She said Helen should submit an application anyway. Said it couldn't hurt. Helen asked the deadline. The woman said applications were due June 30th, 1987. It was May 22nd. Helen went back to the Branson Avenue Library that afternoon, asked the reference librarian where to find forms for federal civilian employment applications. The librarian walked her to a shelf with 2 blue binders. The SF-171, standard form for application for federal employment. 43 pages when completed in full. Helen took the binder to a table, spent 4 hours going through it section by section. She submitted the application by certified mail on June 2nd, kept the receipt. The notification came in late July. A letter, 2 pages. Department of Defense letterhead. The Reserve Analyst Integration Initiative had reviewed 74 applications. 11 positions had been offered. Helen Marsh was one of the 11. She drove to Arlington, Virginia with the clothes she needed for 2 weeks in a single suitcase. A neighbor agreed to collect her mail for $20 per month. She sublet the Fayetteville apartment to a Fort Bragg staff sergeant and his wife for $475 per month, which was $25 below her own rent. The math worked. The Diaz Washington field office was in a building on Army-Navy Drive, close enough to the Pentagon that she could see the helicopter pad from the parking structure. She reported on August 3rd, 1987, wore a charcoal blazer over a gray blouse. Civilian clothes. She'd been a federal employee for 9 years, and this was the first time she was required to wear a visitor lanyard. The security desk ran her visitor badge. A GS-12 analyst named Paul Torres met her in the lobby, walked her to the 4th floor, explained that her temporary authorization allowed her access to 3 areas of the building. Not the main analysis floor, not the classified document room, not the Signals Intelligence Division. She worked in a room with 6 other contract analysts, open source material, foreign language newspapers, trade journals from East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, she translated. Summarized, field reports through an unclassified channel. The work was competent, but narrow. Her entire language skill set was being applied to about 20% of its capacity. She translated a Hungarian economics journal for 3 consecutive mornings. It was published quarterly. It discussed pig iron output. Torres stopped by the room on her 5th day, asked how she was settling in. She told him the work was fine. She asked whether the division's Central European Economic Analysis team used the same open-source publications she was reviewing. He said they did. She asked whether any of her summaries would be cross-referenced with the classified signals data she'd previously worked with at Fort Bragg. He said he didn't think so. The channels were separate. She thanked him, went back to the Hungarian Economics Journal. She had been in the building for 22 days when it happened. She'd stayed late on a Thursday. Most of the contract staff left at 5:30. Helen's translation of a Czechoslovak military procurement digest had flagged something she wanted to finish before leaving, a reference in the September 1986 issue to a domestic electronics manufacturing order that she'd seen a cross-reference for somewhere else. She spent 40 minutes finding it. It was in a Polish trade bulletin from October 1986. The cross-reference was small. Specific, a component supplier named in both documents, 14 months apart, purchasing similar quantities of a particular semiconductor type. On its own, it was a footnote. In context, it might be a pattern. She wrote up a 3-page summary, attached both source documents, placed it in the unclassified channel submission box at 7:18 p.m. The building was quiet. Fluorescent lights. The hum of the HESFAX system. Her footsteps on the linoleum on the way to the elevator. The elevator doors opened on the lobby level. The fingerprint reader to her left was not a system she had access to. She knew that. She had been briefed on day one about which areas required biometric access. The door beyond the fingerprint panel led to the secure analysis wing. She had walked past that panel 22 times in 22 days and not touched it. She did not touch it then, either. She walked past it and left the building. The call came the following Tuesday morning. Not from Paul Torres. From a woman named Susan Caldwell, who identified herself as a branch chief, Central European Analysis Division. Caldwell asked whether Helen could come in at 2 p.m. Helen said yes. Susan Caldwell was 49, had short gray hair and reading glasses she wore on a lanyard around her neck. Her office had 2 windows and a shelf of blue binders that looked like the ones at the Branson Avenue Library. She had Helen's 3-page summary on her desk. She said she'd read it 3 times. Said the semiconductor cross-reference had been caught by one of her analysts from classified signals intercepts, but not until November 1987, 2 months after Helen had flagged it from open-source material alone. She asked Helen to walk her through the analytical process. Helen walked her through it. The Hungarian journal first. The Polish bulletin. The specific component. The 14-month gap between procurement orders suggesting a second-phase manufacturing cycle. The supplier name appearing in both documents under different transliterations that could be missed without native-level familiarity with both Czech and Polish technical terminology. Caldwell listened without interrupting. When Helen finished, Caldwell put her reading glasses on and looked at something in the file folder on her desk. She asked how long Helen had been doing this kind of cross-referencing work. Helen said 9 years at Fort Bragg and 22 days in that building. Caldwell wrote something on a yellow legal pad. She told Helen that the Reserve Analyst Integration Initiative only authorized unclassified work. Helen said she understood. Caldwell said there was a second authorization process that could be filed under an emergency basis. Not 60 to 90 days, typically 7 business days. It had never been used for someone in reinstatement review status. That didn't mean it couldn't be. Helen asked whether the process required her to do anything. Caldwell said she'd need to sign some forms. Helen said she could sign forms. The emergency authorization came through in 9 business days. On a Wednesday morning in September 1987, Helen Marsh pressed her right index finger to the biometric reader outside the Secure Analysis Wing on the first floor of the DIA building on Army-Navy Drive. The light went green. The door opened. She was wearing the same charcoal blazer she'd worn on August 3rd. Civilian clothes. The guard at the interior desk asked for her ID. She handed it over. He checked it, looked at the screen, looked back at her, handed it back. She walked to her new workstation. The classified war room was not a dramatic space. Beige walls, drop ceiling, 12 desks arranged in 3 rows. The terminals were IBM compatible, running a classified network that looked almost identical to the unclassified terminal she'd been using down the hall. The difference was what the terminal could access. She worked there for the next 14 months. 7-day weeks in the first 2 months while 3 active analyses were underway. Then, a more regular schedule. She rebuilt a working relationship with the Fort Bragg signals team through the interdivision network. Her November 1986 assessment on Soviet armored positioning in the East German corridor came up once, indirectly, in a briefing that referenced neurosatellite data. Nobody mentioned the discrepancy between that data and the division consensus estimate. Nobody mentioned that her assessment had been right. She didn't mention it either. Didn't need to. Her TSI clearance was formally reinstated on November 9, 1987. The same week, a different wall in Germany began to show cracks that would take 2 more years to fully give. The reinstatement letter was 1 page. Government letterhead. She read it once and filed it. Major Gerald T. Harwick received a lateral transfer to a logistics assignment at Fort Lee, Virginia, in early 1988. Helen heard about it secondhand through a former colleague who was still at Bragg. She didn't record this anywhere. It wasn't relevant to the work. What was relevant was the work. In the 14 months she spent in the Central European Analysis Division at DIA, her cross-language, cross-source analytical method was formally documented and adopted as a supplemental protocol for open-source integration. The protocol didn't carry her name. It was titled CESA 7, Cross-Source Evaluation for Structured Analysis, version 7, as if 6 prior versions had existed. They hadn't. She was the first. 3 other analysts were trained on the method in 1988. 5 more in 1989. The method spread the way methods do in institutional environments, quietly, through briefings and informal conversations, and the kind of adoption that happens when something simply works better than what came before. No announcement. No credit ceremony. Helen Marsh left the DIA in 1991. Not under pressure. Not under review. She'd been offered a permanent senior position and turned it down. She moved to Annapolis, Maryland, where she started a company called Meridian Analytical Group with 2 former colleagues. The company contracted with federal agencies for open-source intelligence analysis. It had 3 employees in the first year. 11 by 1995, 23 by 2001. When the demand for exactly that kind of work changed overnight. The cardboard box she'd carried out of Fort Bragg in April 1987 sat in a storage closet at the Annapolis office for years. She unpacked it fully in 2003 when the office moved. The travel mug, the framed photo, the Spanish dictionary, pages yellowed at the edges. The map with 14 pins was not in the box. She'd left it on the wall at Fort Bragg, where it wasn't hers to take. She didn't need it anymore. Hadn't needed it for a long time. The 89-cent yellow legal pad from the Walgreens on Branson Avenue was still in the box too. 41 pages of notes on federal administrative review processes, written in the Fayetteville Public Library in May of 1987. She kept it. Didn't throw it out. Set it on her desk in the new Annapolis office. It was still there in 2009. Same desk. Same pad. Still there.